Okay, welcome back to Zero Cool Gaming, and today we're going to be doing a review of a game called Folklore. Excuse me, Folklore.
I lost my mother when I was very young. My only memory of her is telling me bedtime fairy tales about a mysterious village. The village of Doolin, where the living could meet the dead. And now she tells me she's alive. Mother, why did you wait so long?
I told you! This is as far as I go!
Please, just get us a little closer to the shore.
Not a chance in hell! We'd never make it back! I have a family to look after, miss, so leave me out of this! I'm decided! We're turning back!
Wait! I must see my mother!
It's for your own good!
Thank you. I appreciate it. I'll get there on my own.
Miss, you'll be killed? No!
A dark cloud cast over.
Encounters are constantly reported in all corners of the globe.
Okay, so what is this game about? Well, it's an odd game, but it does have a storyline to it. There is gameplay to it. I can't say that it's unique gameplay, but it's put in a way that makes it unique. I guess that's the best way to describe it. So first I'll start out with the story, and then I'll explain parts of the gameplay, and we'll go from there. So the story starts out with a young girl who is looking for her mother, and she got a letter from her mother, even though her mother is dead. And she travels to this town, which is known as the Town of the Dead, and while there, she finds the ability to travel back and forth between the real world and the netherworld. She also has a companion along with her that is a scarecrow. And that scarecrow is basically the tutorial, because it explains to you how to do things. There is a tutorial too, don't get me wrong. But it gives like in-game reasons for why you're doing things. So this young girl, as she travels through the netherworld, comes in contact with different beings, and then, which are the bosses of the game, by the way. And you defeat each of these bosses, and as you defeat them, the realms that these bosses were in are essentially freed from the tyranny that they were imposing upon the inhabitants of that area. And there's lots of different bosses in this game. And there's lots of different creatures in this game that will attack you, and there's lots of different people in this game for you to interact and talk with. It's partially a point-and-click adventure where you investigate different areas and you find information and items, and part of it is a action-adventure game where you use different creatures that you capture the essence of after you defeat them, and then use their essence to help you attack other creatures and defeat them as well.
Amazing.
The game itself revolves around this girl going there, of course, to find her mother. And while she does so, she also learns about her past and different things that had happened in her past. And then you also have a reporter for an occult magazine who is essentially summoned to this town by an odd phone call that begs for his
She only
help.
went to search for her mother.
And he travels to the town to find out what's going on there and why someone from this, town of the dead would call him for his help. Shortly after he arrives, he meets the same young girl that came there because of a letter from her mother. And he too also has a companion that travels with him that looks like it looks like the guy from Phantom of the Opera. He wears a mask that is quite similar to it to hide his face, but he actually has no face because he's a phantom. And the same thing applies. This phantom is basically the tutorial and tells you how to play this character and what he can and cannot do. And there's a couple ways to play this game. You can go through the whole game as a single character, which is the fastest way to play it. And you'll probably get through the game in, 15 hours or less. Or you can go through each section as both characters, in which case you learn more about the lore of the game and the story behind the game. But this obviously takes twice as long. And essentially each character goes through the same areas that the previous character did and does basically the same actions. There's a little difference, don't get me wrong. And you both fight the same bosses and defeat them and free those areas from their tyranny. The main reason for playing each character through each section is to learn more about the story itself, as you get the story told from different perspectives. Eventually, as you travel through the game and you meet the different inhabitants of the game, they tell you about some of the horrible things that have been happening. The fairies that arrived in the netherworld, the societies that have come about as a result of their influence, and the dangers that they pose to the area, the changes that have occurred as a result of their influence, the creatures that they use to enforce their rules, regulations, laws, whatever you want to call them. So, essentially the young girl who's trying to find out about her mother ends up learning more and more about things that happened in her past, and these things are obviously directly connected as to why her mother disappeared. Basically 17 years before this, she ended up getting possessed by a fairy, and at times this fairy completely overtakes her, and she's not aware of what happens during the time that this occurs. The occultist, who's a reporter for the Occult magazine, is not just learning about her past, but other events that have happened in the past. And he finds her story to be very interesting, so he wants to learn more about her, learn more about her past, and learn more about the netherworld and why it's in the turmoil that it is. Eventually she ends up being captured by a couple of owls that bring her to a court proceeding, and the judge of that court proceeding finds her guilty of several crimes, basically using the powers that should never be used in order to make herself capable of moving back and forth between the mortal realm and the netherworld, which the guy is also guilty of. He just did it in a different way. But the court doesn't see the way that he did it as a crime, for whatever reason that is. And he interviews her and finds the truth behind why different things happened and why the same things have happened to him, and he doesn't see her intervention as a crime, obviously, like the court does. And the court itself is a creation or a result of the influence of these fairies and the horrible things that they're doing to the netherworld. So, needless to say, this is it's a pretty in-depth story. It's a pretty in-depth game, and the lore surrounding it is pretty insane, to say the least. But it makes for an interesting story. But basically the gameplay is you go around, and as you defeat different monsters, you collect their souls, and then you can use an ability from that monster as either an attack or defense. As you get further into the game, the attacks get stronger, the defense gets better, and different abilities, of course, appear as a result of you collecting more and more monsters to use in your repertoire of things to use against the new monsters that you come across, including the boss battles. The boss battles are designed in a way to require you to use specific monsters that you've collected up to that point to defeat them. And there is a pattern to the attacks and abilities that the bosses use, and the different monsters that you've collected will give you the proper defense or attacks or abilities to avoid those attacks and defend yourself properly and eventually bring down the boss itself. Of course, the bosses are a lot more difficult than the monsters that you find throughout the realm, or the normal creatures that you find throughout the realm. So, as you can see, there's quite a bit to this game, and quite a bit that you need to learn. And there's a few ways that you can play this game. Truly. One of the best ways to play it is to do a lot of grinding, going back and replaying sections over and over again, so that you can not just build up your monster repertoire, but to make the monsters you have a little more powerful along the way. This requires, like I said, a lot of grinding and a lot more time. But the end result is that the bosses that you face are easier to defeat. It doesn't require as much precision as it would if you were just to play straight through the game. So the way I played it, obviously, was to go back and grind my way through the game, and I hate grinding, I really do. Which is probably one of the reasons that I don't see this as one of my more favorite games to play. It has a lot of things like TZA in it. TZA you can play through very quickly, depending on how you play it, or you can spend hundreds upon hundreds of hours playing through it if you want to try to get more powerful characters, more powerful, what's the word that I'm looking for? Monsters, I guess, that you can unlock, that you can then use in battles, and then you can level them up. You can play the item world to find better items and more powerful monsters that you can then unlock and use. There's all sorts of things in TZA that you can do, truly. I would even go as far as to say that the game is almost never ending. But if you just, like I said, play through the straight game and don't worry about any of that, you can get through the main storyline in it rather quickly. The same thing with this game. If you just play straight through it without worrying about any of that, you can get through the storyline rather quickly. And if you want to double that, like I said, you play each character through each section. As you complete a section, it'll allow you to save the game before you start the next section or restart that section as a different character. So lots of things to do, truly. Lots of things to learn, improve upon, lots of things to gather up, lots of different items that you can learn about and collect as you go. And truly there's lots of lore in this game, or storyline that you can engage with as you play through it, which reveals little bit by little bit what exactly is actually going on. It's pretty good about making sure that the little tidbits that it reveals to you along the way doesn't spoil the end of the game. But obviously the way that I review these games is I tell you the whole story as we go. So, you know, that's just how I've decided to do my reviews. Reading reviews from other people, a lot of times I find that some of them are just blatant lies. And in other cases, they, in many ways, do the same thing. They just sit there and reveal the whole game anyway. And that's the more decent reviews. So as a result of that, I just decided I'm going to tell people what the game is, what it's about, what the storyline is, and then you can decide with the information that I provide whether or not that's the type of game you would like to engage with. I also take little 1-minute clips, or maybe a little longer, 1 minute, 5, 10, whatever, clips of the games, as you can see the cutscenes, the gameplay, and decide whether or not that's something you might enjoy. I don't know if this is, the best way to do it, but it's the way that I decided to do it because I feel that it's a more complete way of going through what the game is and give you a full realm of information to decide if that's something that you would enjoy. Alright, so even though the fairies had been divided, even though there were aggressive beings in the afterlife, even though all of these things were true, and the fact that the fairy king himself, in his arrogance, believed that not only was he the only being capable of defeating the evil that had infected his realm, he feared that the humans' involvement would only serve to spread it further. The reality that is eventually revealed is that she was never possessed by a fairy. In fact, what was happening to her was a direct result of her mother doing everything she could to protect her. And all of those lost moments in time that she experienced throughout her life was because of this. And it was also because of the force that had infected the afterlife and was causing corruption all over the place. And that's essentially what you're meant to defeat in the end of this and return the afterlife to what it's supposed to be. And, basically bring peace to it and this, that, and the other, all those sorts of things, of course. And the end of it is basically you visiting the man who had been helping you, sort of, the reporter from the occult magazine, having an odd conversation with him, leaving, and him realizing that there's no way he could tell anybody about exactly what had happened because nobody would believe it. And that's how this story ends. So, it's an interesting story, don't get me wrong. And one of the things that makes the gameplay kind of interesting and different is that there are several different aspects of the gameplay. especially on how you actually retrieve the souls of the defeated enemies and make them into, or acquire them, I should say, as different abilities that you can use against other enemies. And a lot of it has to do with how you use the controller. It takes advantage of aspects of the controller that most games don't, like the positioning of the controller itself. Whether the controller is being flipped up or flipped down or turned to the right or turned to the left. Most games on PS3 don't use this function that is within the controller to recognize what position that it's in. And because it can do that, this game takes advantage of it, which makes for an interesting game, truly. I guess you could say the same thing about some PS2 games that actually use the button functions, where there's a soft press and a hard press to the button functions, and the controller is capable of telling the difference between the two. It's like a midway point and a, all the way down point, which makes for an interesting, game mechanic, regardless of how irritating that game mechanic can be when actually used within a game. All the different games that I've ever played that actually used that on the PS2 were very irritating to use, because it would constantly mistaken a half press for no press at all, or if you pressed a little more, it would count it as a full press. So even though the controller itself and the buttons were capable of this function, they didn't always register it properly. And the same thing with this function on the PS3. Even though the controller is capable of knowing what position it's in, it didn't always register it properly, and as a result of that, it could make gameplay very difficult at times, and seemingly almost impossible, because of the fact that it wouldn't register properly if you moved it too fast or too slow. All of these things were a problem. You had to find just the right speed to move it, just the right speed to do things, and anything outside of a pretty tight realm of speed would be either too fast or too slow. So it too had issues, and I don't know if that's a programming issue or if that's a controller issue, or I have no idea. I learned what needed to be done, when, how, and why, just through trial and error. But I did find it to be a clunky kind of mechanic that was being implemented in order to change up game mechanics in, very unique ways. But its implementation was harsh, to say the least. And like I said, there's lots of creatures in this game that you can collect the souls of, or whatever they call it. I know they don't call it souls, but regardless, that's what it looks like. You basically hit the enemy with different attacks. Specific attacks will cause it to expose its soul faster than others. Sometimes it would only expose under specific circumstances and specific attacks in a particular order. So they always tried to change it up in that way. They always tried to make it to where you had to use the different abilities that you've been given thus far in order to achieve an end goal, or or capture a specific soul, I guess is the best way to put that. And like I said, this game had a few different mechanics to it. besides the fight mechanic and the soul stripping mechanic, you had experience that you would gain, your different monsters that you collected, like I said, would level up and gain different abilities or turn into completely, I shouldn't say completely different creatures, but new creatures would be formed as a result with new abilities. And you were constantly having to switch all of these creatures in and out of your usable creature bar. And you could use up to 4 creatures at any time. Well, like I said, it was an interesting mechanic. I've seen different games take this, a step further. A good example would be like Darksiders. You had 4 main functions, and then you could press a button and you had 4 alternate functions for those same buttons. But there's lots of other games that implement the same thing, where you have 4 main functions and you hit a particular button and you were given 4 alternate functions for those same buttons. And then you could change out what all of those functions were. Which makes for more in-depth gameplay, gives you more options, that sort of thing. This particular game didn't do that, but it's an older game, so this was the type of programming that was implemented into later games. As they, use this mechanic more and more often in different games, they learned that they could also expand it. Nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's kind of how games evolved. And then they, like today, games have de-evolved and just become easier and easier, to where, a 4-year-old could play the game just as easily as a 16-year-old, and both could beat the game with minimal understanding of it. Games for everyone, as they call it, which in truth makes games for no one. And they're starting to learn this the hard way, as more and more people reject these games that they're creating, and more studios go out of business as a result of it. And while, although it is depressing to see these different studios go out of business, it also needs to happen. And I say that because these studios have been co-opted and corrupted by an ideology that, at its core, as far as I'm concerned, is evil. It is an ideology that hates me to every fiber of its bone, and would be perfectly happy to see my life destroyed, if not myself dead. And I don't agree with ideologies to think that's okay. Period. I am not going to give money to people who hate me. And if they have to go completely out of business in order to destroy this infestation of ideology into the human psyche, then so be it. Those who have been trained to believe and understand and adhere to what I consider a sickness and mental illness, as far as I'm concerned, that's what it is, should have their lives destroyed in much the same way that they try to destroy everyone else's, and have done so on many cases. Like I said, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And if they feel that it is appropriate to destroy people's lives that do not adhere to their sick, twisted ideology, then I feel that their lives should be destroyed just as completely. Quite literally. Regardless of how they scream and yell that it's unfair, it's not. They started it. And if all goes well, and human beings start to actually realize and pay attention to how destructive and disgusting this ideology is, then they will have their lives destroyed because of what they've done to others, quite literally. And I don't see anything wrong with that. They're the type of people who would scream and yell while they beat on you to death about how you're harming them, and your words are violence, while they're the ones enacting actual violence and death upon you. That's just who these people are. It is sick, it is twisted, and it is wrong in every way imaginable. Anyway. That's my rant for the day. I hope that you enjoy the rest of yours. If you could hit the like, subscribe, rumble, follow buttons, all that does help. And I will talk to you later.